Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's been about 5 days since I made a video. It's probably the longest gap I've gone in over a year and a half, I would think. But things are getting busy, got things going on. Making progress on the coffee shop, which is exciting. And my DJ work's starting to show up. And I booked a couple residencies moving forward where I'll be working Saturdays and Sundays, doing the brunch gig again. Which for me is my favorite gig of all time. Evenings are fun, but they're a different beast. And being able to play these brunches, it really allows me to play jazz, first of all, Saturday, Sunday morning. Who doesn't want to hear a little jazz? Even if you don't know jazz, it somehow still makes sense to you. And I mix it in with a lot of other elements, soul, R&B, little elements of hip-hop, some reggae, some new kind of dream synth pop stuff. And I seam it all together, make it all kind of fit, because it all does if you know what you're doing. And play for 7 decades. And it can really cover some weird ground from Bobby Vinton and Roy Orbison all the way through to Juice WRLD and Khalid. It really covers a wide spectrum. But jazz is kind of this paste, this mortar that glues all these various bricks together. And especially the jazz and the blues side of things, you can really seam together lots of different sounds and make everything feel connected. So I'm excited about that. Back in Minneapolis, right in the heart of things. It's great locations, both of them. So that's great news. Thank you all for your kind thoughts and prayers this last year plus, hoping and telling me that the work would come back. So here we go, back on the saddle, which I'm so excited about it. You know, I did a gig for them last Sunday, and it was really fantastic. And of course, this is a company I've worked for before, so I already have a long-standing rapport with them, and there's an excitement on their part, the staff's part, because we bring in energy, we bring in excitement. There's a palatable feeling in the room when I'm seaming all this vinyl together. And it's so vinyl dominated that it kind of catches people right when they walk in. They're like, oh, interesting, cool. You know, they take the photographs and they show their kids, and it's pretty awesome. So I just want to share that. Yeah, we're moving on the coffee shop. We've got some contractors come through. There might actually be a little bit of a mess in this room over the next few months as some changes happen in that little open side door right there. That doorway. And there's going to be the coffee kitchen. And I think we're going to be cutting that wall there open right there with an arched kind of window. I know that record shelf's going to have to move. But we'll see how it all plays out. You know, we got some time. It'll probably be a good 2 months, 3 months of this slowly happening. I might start filming my episodes in the back lounge. We'll see how things go. Anyway, moving on. My first thoughts today are my friend Ken McAuliffe out of New York. He's been a long-time jazz writer, has a great Facebook jazz group called Jazz Vinyl Lovers, which of course I've been a member of for a long time. And it was actually Ken who really pushed me, along with my wife, to do a YouTube channel. My wife had said it for a while, because you have so much to say, blah, 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 but I didn't really even watch YouTube. You know, I would watch a music video in there once in a while, but I didn't really follow or didn't have any connection to it or understand it very well. But it was Ken that kind of said, you know, what the things you say on this group, the things you post, comment, you probably would be a good YouTuber. And it was after 6 months of him kind of saying that, every once in a while pushing me towards it, and my wife kind of echoing that, where I started this channel 2+ years ago. So thanks again, Ken. But I also have 2 Facebook groups that I started, jazz related. One's called JVC, the Jazz Vinyl Club. Please sign up to that. We welcome all people and keep it about jazz and vinyl for the most part. And there's also a Blue Note group that I started with 10,000 plus people in it now. I'll try to remember to put links to both of those. Anyway, Ken's group, there ends up being a lot of arguments in his group that I don't really get in my groups. And it's interesting to me. I'm not really sure. Part of it's he's much more of a diligent moderator than I am. As I've started to YouTube more and become more of a communicator through that forum, my Facebook groups, I moderate them mildly, but I'm not super, I still post records there, but I'm not really checking people's posts and deleting stuff very often. If someone flags it, I'll look at it and delete it if I have to. But I'm not super investigative and following all the developments on my Facebook groups. And Ken's a fairly intensive New Yorker, fiery. He's got some, not Sicilian, but Maltese blood in him. He's got that little fire. And when you're from New York and you're doing your thing, a bachelor in New York, you got a little edge to you. So I think he can be abrasive to people a little bit at times. But it's weird how that group will just sink into these long arguments. They'll go on for days. Sometimes I'll have to close them. And we've actually talked about me and him a few times, and the frustration he has sometimes, because he ends up getting into these things with people where he just gets stuck, not knowing exactly how he wants to handle it, how he wants to be perceived. Does he care if he's a dick? It's part of his whole shtick, and he has that impatience, I think, with dumb, which that's part of New York. I have impatience with dumb as well, but he seems confrontational with it at times. But also, there's just times where the group will just get into these long, and rarely is it about music. That's what's crazy. I talk a lot of politics and social issues and race, and my groups don't really, my comments don't really have debates on them. I get once in a while, a wild card, but very rarely does it sink into some kind of this stuff. And oftentimes, their stuff will be somewhat political or socially debating something, but most often it's about a pressing thing. And someone insults someone's pressing and makes their feelings hurt. And there was a big thing recently about the European pressings versus, other digital pressing, sourcing, and all that stuff. And I stay out of it. I used to kind of get more involved in that stuff, but it just seems like such a waste of time. Sitting there arguing over pressings and validity, and none of these musicians are getting paid for their work at this point. Some of these labels are making sure that some of the families are getting a trickle down, but it's a trickle down, believe it. You ain't making it rich off some vinyl company today repressing 10,000 versions of your album. That's not going to put a lot of money in your pocket. And it's good that they sought the families out and are kind of paying tribute in that way. And that's only a small percentage that are even doing that. Another one was about the tone poets. A whole other argument, and just ranting complaints about the cracks in the seam that come from the nice gatefolds. Some of them have had some sound issues and noise issues. And it just feels a bit like you're in a nice restaurant and there was one flaw. And instead of talking about the ambiance, the atmosphere, the meal, service, there's these, my fork was dirty. And on my salad, they put a tomato where I said no tomatoes. It's like these little squawks about these little imperfections. And some of them are bigger imperfections than others. But man, it just sure sinks into this ripping tone poet hate cycle. And they're replacing them if they're defective guys. It's and the vinyl itself, if it's got imperfections, by all means that should be returned. And that's going to happen. People have asked in those arguments that this happened as much. I don't think it happened back in the day. Vinyl was being pressed in such gigantic numbers. The presses were on a much different scale. This mom and pop small vinyl industry today, it's still a big thing, but the pressing volumes are minuscule compared to what they were back in the day. There's more room for error. There's more room for some vinyl not to have been put in quite properly, or just different things. You're not running this giant seamless industry. It's a bit more, we're piecing things together. And honestly, quality control costs money. You want to have every record inspected before it gets mailed out, you're going to pay twice as much for that record. You're paying $25 on Amazon. $25. You're going to replace it if they need you to, if it needs to be replaced. To have all these people making all these complaints. It just seems so negative. Ignores the fact how beautiful a job that's being done, how many of them are not blemished, and again, no discussion of the music at all. And Ken will sometimes get drawn into them, be short with someone's feelings will get hurt, and they'll be like, why are you such a dick? And then he's like stuck between sticking with his guns. Again, it's his group, and Ken's a dear friend. We chat all the time, so I'm not in any way saying he needs to do what I say he's doing. He can do what he wants. I just don't understand how these conversations always get so long and drawn out. And on some level, the audiophile fan is a different creature than a jazz fan. And these people making these comments about, it was a little pop on track 3 and it ruined the entire experience. It just boggles my mind. I'm reading Mark Twain, and the hole in the B had ink in it, so the B wasn't perfect, and it ruined the book. That's not possible. It's not a thing that could be. The book's still fantastic, regardless of that little flaw. And again, sound issues with the vinyl itself, that's a little bit more excusable. But for the most part, they were all saying it was a small part of one track on side 2. So there's no commentary about the music or what it made them feel, or the excitement, or the setting, how the atmosphere, the tone of the players. It's just my record, and it's just such a different. And again, Ken's more of an audiophile. His channel's always been that. His group's always had that, dimension to it, which my groups have never been about that. I never really wanted to talk pressings. You don't hear me on my episodes saying, this is the first, second. I don't really talk pressing. It's not really that interesting to me. It's have a value only in a resale consideration. And I'm not talking about selling my records, so why would I talk about what issues they have? It doesn't matter if it's a Scorpio or a first pressing Blue Note. I don't feel the need to say, this is what. It's just not that information that I think is what is important. There's a lot of other things I could talk about this record that has no relationship to any of those issues. And so, again, I think that's just part of, I get discouraged by it because it just makes me realize how much of the jazz vinyl community is kind of audiophile snobs, wanting the perfect pressing, and it's got to be silent so I can, and it's okay. It's not a wrong thing. I'm not trying to, I respect great sound systems, and I've seen a lot of them through Ken. I've seen a lot of them, Shigeru Suzuki in Japan, what a system that guy has, but it's never really been something I don't even care about the needles and the style. I want you to hear the music. That's all I want to talk about is the music. I don't want to talk about none of the other stuff. That's not interesting to me. It's obviously interesting to a lot of people, because there's audiophile channels out there that have thousands of subscribers and people watching them, but I start watching that stuff and I'm like, yawn. What about the music? How many times can a person talk about a record and never once talk about the playing, the ability, the tempo, the mode, the concept, the emotion behind the art? It boggles my mind. And it's not a criticism, it's just I'm different. And I'm thinking some of my people on this channel are also different. That's probably why some of you are here. But if you're coming to this channel asking for breakdowns of pressings and how's the tone point, I'll tell you what the music sounds like and what it made me feel and what the context that it's in. But it sure seems like some of those arguments are just a waste of time. And if your pressing has a flaw, send it back. You don't got to spend all this time spewing on this forum, potentially turning off young fans or new fans to this forum and making them go, tone poets are no good. I saw this whole, it's crap. They're beautiful, well done products that should be getting nothing but praise. And because of the scale of what's being done, sure, there's mistakes. And again, you want to pay $50 for it? They can have 5 people watching everything that comes off the presses and checking each thing. But outside of sourcing it to Thailand or having 4 guys out of college doing, you're going to pay way more. I'm fine with the $26. It's a wonderful product for that price and deserves all the credit and recognition for putting it out there for people at that market value. It's great. Kudos, guys. So, and I know Ken gets frustrated with it too. As much the arguing and he ends up getting into it with people kind of, and because we've talked about it, he gets frustrated with it. He's asked me at times kind of how he thinks I should go forward with things, and I'm like, it's your group. You got to pick your own tone and how you want to moderate. I'll give him my 2 cents, but just these long, drawn-out arguments, and I'll scroll through it and I'll lose interest. A couple minutes down, but again, there's just no music, nothing about the music. It's not even. My record had a flaw on side 1, track 2, but man, that music's great. You can't even put a caveat in there saying, I listened to the record and I loved it. It's like they took it off and put it back and said, I gotta send this back. There's no value to it. And I guess this is where it comes down to the old archaeologist argument for me. I feel like a lot of these collectors are the guy who has the $20,000 Ming Vase on his shelf. It's lit nicely, and my guests come over and adore it. They're like, oh, that's fantastic. The ladies in my courtyard will come in and be like, oh, have you seen his Ming Vase? It's absolutely delightful. And the guy can't even tell you really anything about the Ming Dynasty, what time frame that comes from, or what river valley that sprang up in. You're lucky sometimes if he can even tell you it's in Asia. He's got the perfect ping. It survived 1,000 years. Look at it. It's beautiful. But then there's that archaeologist who can find a pottery shard. A shard. And it might even have some stain on it left from how they colored it once. Or an inscription saying who the artist could have been. And looking at how the pottery was shaped, they can tell you what era it was made in. From a shard of it. Like, oh, the constituency of that, the way it's marked, the way it's cooked, baked, the materials involved in it. This is from this epoch. This is from those people in that river valley, and the remnants of what's inside the shard sometimes can tell me what they were cooking and eating and collecting about these people. The archaeologist can glean more from a fractured shard of a piece of pottery than the Ming Vase man can with his perfect specimen. And I think we need to approach jazz more as archaeologists more frequently and just say, this is an old record that's got some skips and pops, but god damn, what does this tell me about these people that came up through that great river valley? They once picked cotton for an undesirable master, but migrated through that river up into these great urban centers and spoke about their experiences in this pottery and end up becoming the consciousness, the rhythm and groove, and the heart and soul of a nation. You want to talk about freedom? The fact that we all are so connected to black music, even if we don't recognize it, the blues, rock and roll, R&B, soul, pop music, it's all so coming from that black blues, gospel, church, swing, African pulse experience. It's hard to escape the blackness of all of American culture musically. It's a powerful testament. The pottery is there to tell us the whole story. And the shard can tell you so much if your heart and your mind and your ears are open. The liner notes are still there to be read. What did they etch? The music's still there to speak to you, to tell you. And even if a piece of the music is flawed, the rest of that piece has a story to be told. It's sacred. And even modern reproductions of that pottery can still tell you a story. the narration's still in there. The script has still been preserved in this modern pottery vessel that's a replica of these once great people. The modern pressings still have the story. It's sacred, it's priceless. And for us to walk through life disposing of every pottery shard, oh, it's just a piece. Oh, it's only 80% of the jug. The amphora, oh, it's only 89% there. There's a chunk missing. I'm going to throw that away. And I'm going to complain about how it's just awful. There's a hole in this 2,000-year-old piece of treasure. Strange to me. That's all I can say. I want to move on. The source of today's episode is, again, a rare record by a rare artist that most people don't know about, that you should know about. He's absolutely fantastic. His name is Dave Burns. Me and Scott Baldwin talk about Dave Burns frequently, and he's kind of centered around the Chicago scene, even though he's really a New Jersey, Perth Amboy guy and spent most of his life in New York. He's definitely connected with the Chicago sound of the 50s and 60s. He comes up listening to bebop. He goes to Minton's at a young age. At the age of 9, he starts playing trumpet. And he hears guys like Dizzy Gillespie playing at Minton's at that young age. And he ends up joining Al Cooper's Savoy Sultans from 41 to 43. And I'm guessing that's the Savoy Ballroom, a group, not the label, I would think. He joins the Air Force from 43 to 45. Again, the black musician wasn't given any escape. And the whites too, by the end of the war, it was, but it wasn't equal. The number of black musicians versus white musicians in this period that got sent off, it's by no means parallel. But in the war, he ends up starting a band. He leads a band, actually. And that band has the great James Moody in it, the great flautist and sax player. And because of the war, he joins Dizzy Gillespie's band for a year in 1946. In 1950, he plays with Ellington from 50 to 52. And Ellington's group is fantastic at that point. And Dave Burns is a soloist and a player in that group. And then from 52 to 58, he actually plays with James Moody, who was at Argo for the most part, also has some Prestige records. And he's playing on a lot of those records for the great James Moody. And those are great records. They're actually not that hard to find. When you have James Moody and Dave Burns, that's noteworthy. And as the 60s comes along, he signs with the label Vanguard of New York. It's kind of a smaller label in some ways, but it has a rock and roll presence going into the 60s. Guys like Country Joe and the Fish, if I recall, were on Vanguard. There's other rock and roll from that era that's definitely on Vanguard. And it's a wide range of stuff that the label has. But there's some great jazz stuff sprinkled in there. The 10-inch era on Vanguard is actually very jazz-oriented. I mean, if not all jazz, but again, that's the early 50s. So all the other stuff, rock and roll, R&B, is all kind of germinating at that point. But it says he gets into the 60s where Vanguard gives him 2 records as a leader. And it's his only 2 records as a leader, which is a little bit surprising. This is, I believe, his first one, Dave Burns. And what a great record this is. And let's see who's on this, if I can take Ken real quick. Herbie Morgan, Steve Davis, Kenny Barron, and Edgar Bateman. So it's a fairly anonymous crew, but you really hear his ability. And then this second one is outstanding. And I want to again start the song over. This is fantastic. This is Dave Burns, Al Gray, Herman Wright. Okay. Harold Mabern, Billy Mitchell, Bobby Hutcherson plays on this. Otis Candy Finch and Willie Correa's on the timboli on a couple of tracks. I think this one's called Now Ain't It. Double check that, yeah. And it's just got this kind of melancholic minor key going on. It's got, and his tone has a tightness to it. It's clean, it's tight, it's got these little edges to it. And he's also fantastic at tempo. When you talk about the Browns, the Freddie Hubbards, the Booker Littles, Burns could really fire. He can play some incredible up-tempo stuff. But here he is playing with a mute, showing you some of his diversity. His ability is really incredible. That's probably Billy Mitchell in the tenor. He actually plays one of Billy Mitchell's Smash LPs. Those are both outstanding. Billy Mitchell's a fantastic guy. Detroit, just a great rhythm and blues side of jazz sax player that doesn't get the credit today he deserves, but he played with Basie. You gotta love Billy Mitchell. And the Billy Mitchell Al Gray stuff on the Argo label, that's what Chicago jazz blues sounds like. Outstanding stuff. If you don't love Al Gray and Billy Mitchell together, you are impotent. Because it's such sexually charged, fun, expressive, full of the pulse of sexuality. And it's one of the things I've been trying to think about how to express. And it's not an easy thing to really kind of approach, but there's a gulf between black jazz and white jazz that's hard to define. And it comes in different epiphanies where I feel it and hear it. But I'd say the most definitive way of trying to explain the difference is it's a bit about function versus form. And the blues is all about function. It's not meant to be complicated. It's meant to be that I can play this simple form to express the bulkhead load of overwhelming things I have to say. I don't need complexity. I want a simple, basic form that I can, that's functional, that I can, and I kind of reverse that there, but the functionality of the blues is what's so insanely evident when you listen to a lot of the great black players. From Count Basie to Eddie Lockjaw Davis to Miles Davis. The simplicity of the blues, it's always about, I have things on my mind, I just need a template with which to express those things. And then the white player, who has honestly in a lot of weird ways come to define the modern perception of what jazz is as complicated, full of chords, full of technicality and composition and complexity. That is, a lot of it has been brought to jazz by the white guys who were more about form and designing this crazy cathedral with Gothic flung buttresses and great shaped, all the sacred geometry is locked into cathedrals, from cones to pyramids to triangles to, it's all in those buildings and the blueprints and in the actual form of the building itself. It's how Masons preserve the technology of construction and mathematics is in these buildings. And when you look at these buildings closely, you can see the mathematics and the geometry being preserved throughout these things. So if society breaks down, this building is a living testament to mathematics, to how to get back here, understanding circles and pi and all these elements. So there's a complexity to the form of white jazz musicians like Jerry Mulligan, Gil Evans, Jimmy Joffrey. These guys came to the music and added a lot of form that was partly driven by the fact that their life's experience doesn't have them filled with volumes of things to say. So a simple functionality, that's kind of a little boring to me. I want to make it a little more complex. I don't just need a simple treehouse. I want a very complex structure. And so the form takes over. And the modern perception of jazz that most people have, this complex music with thousands of chords, that's very much from the white developments in the music. And certainly guys like Monk and Mingus were proponents of that, without question. But the elements of jazz throughout the blues history inside of things was always fair. Al Gray. You can't mess with Al Gray. You're going to say some business here that you don't even understand the language. You don't even know a trombone could even say this. I think there's like a throw grammar once. Yeah, I'll tell you when it comes. It's Al Gray. What are you doing, Al? What are you talking about, man? She had to be good. You know, I mean, she had to look real nice, even with the lights off, to make that kind of a sound. It's so beautiful. But the black music has always been simple. It's always been sexual. It's always had that groove, that swing. That's what the swing is. That's what the blues is. That's what the groove is. It's the sexuality of, I want that. I want to go right from dancing to slipping and sliding. I don't want to break rhythm. And white music's always been, from the European tradition, less about rhythm and more about complexity and form. And that's why we don't dance. It's not genetic, it's not DNA. It's the music and art that we grew up with. Pulse wasn't a natural part of our art development. But for the black experience, sex was heaven. Sex was the mansion on the hill. As I've said before, it was the one freedom I had. Money might escape me. The Cadillacs a maybe. That great house on the hill, I'm probably never going to get that. But Jelly Roll. Let me just focus on that. Because I'm just as happy as anybody when I'm deep in the groove. So it's just something I've been trying to express. Just that form versus function. Black versus white. Most of the black cats had so much on their mind. So much they wanted to get off their chest. That sticking within a simple, and even Parker's not about changing chords. He's not rewriting these songs. He's not adding crazy bridges and breaks and newer composition. He's still taking the same basic songs. He's just adding notes within the chords. You know, bebop's not as complex, hard bop's not as complex as people think it is, and there is some great composition happening. Even guys like Mobley come along and Gigi Grice, they're doing composition, but a lot of that's even influenced by the white cats like Mulligan and Jimmy Joffrey. You know, Ellington, of course, is the greatest composer of all time, but Ellington always has a simplicity to him as well. And you can do a lot of great arranging with a band that requires still very minimal chord structure. The chords can be very basic, and I could still have counter melody coming from the strings and the reed woodwinds doing this, and you can still make a complex sounding thing with the simplest of functionality. And it can almost deceive us. But a lot of times Ellington songs aren't filled with thousands of changes. It's just really well arranged and orchestrated, even though the simple is still evident. And Mingus and Monk kind of break that. And even Monk, a lot of his compositions aren't super complex as much as his approach to what notes to play on the chord is what's complex. This is an A minor chord, but I might play you some intervals in there that you might not expect, or take a few notes out and leave. Like, Monk was still using some basic song structure. It's Mingus who really pushes that. It's the white cats for the most part that are driving that sound. So to finish up on the great Dave Burns, he shows up on 3 or 4 Blue Note sessions that are noteworthy. He's on that great Landslide record with Dexter Gordon. He's on Art Taylor's Art's Delight record on Blue Note. He's also on, I got my notes real quick, Rolling with Leo, the great Leo Parker. I've been listening to Leo Parker and Bill Jennings, by the way, lately, from the 50s on King. Man, that's some great stuff. You can just feel the black neighborhoods on those Bill Jennings, Leo Parker records. A lot of stuff for King was recorded in Cincinnati. Some of it was recorded in New York. Just, again, that history is so important to understand the isolation of the black neighborhoods and who these records were being made for. It wasn't like a Beyonce record today where whites are going to be 80% of your audience. Race records, as they were called, they were made for black neighborhoods, and they weren't really meant to be distributed beyond that. And even the Blue Notes and the Prestiges and the Riversides, they were really distributed very locally, often in the black record stores in black neighborhoods like Harlem, parts of Philadelphia, parts of New Jersey. These records weren't meant to go to Wyoming, and they didn't. It wasn't until later when the record labels sell to bigger distributors, but it wasn't like United Artists said, I'm going to reissue all of the Blue Note stuff so I can ship it to Montana, because they'd never had it before. Montana doesn't know about it, never cared, and probably still don't. Not saying there ain't a Blue Note fan somewhere in Montana, but that's beer drinking, cattle ranching, mountain skiing. That Montana's its own subculture of America. It's got a lot of get her done to it. But Burnsy's a fantastic player, and if you hear him on some of his brighter work, he's really a nice, clean player. His sound has some reminiscence of Kenny Dorham, Donald Byrd. He's in that range. So either one of these Dave Burns records, and these were available a couple years ago as reissues, and that's how I have mine. But Burnsy's outstanding. His work with, like I said, Billy Mitchell is really of note. He's also worked with Al Gray, as I mentioned, Willie Bobo, Milt Jackson, Johnny Griffin. You know, when you play with Griffin, you got to have chops. So it's quite an impressive resume for a guy who only got 2 records as a leader. He's a fantastic player. His 2 records are on a pretty outskirts of the industry label, Vanguard. And you don't really hear about him or discover him until grade 6 or 7 as a jazz student. You don't really hear about him for 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. You kind of have to really dig deeper and deeper. And once you have 1,000, 2,000 records of jazz, you start to hear about Al Gray, who's that? Dave Burns, who's that? Billy Mitchell, who's that? It's that next tier guy. And again, Basie has a lot of overplay on all those guys. You know, a lot of these guys learn to swing, and the minimalism and the sound. Jazz is so much simpler than the average conception of it today. That's part of what disturbs me. Is people think it's so complex. Oh, it's so difficult. My brother posted to me the other day. It was funny, but it's not true. A rock guitarist plays 3 chords for 5,000 people. A jazz guitarist will play 5,000 chords for 3 people. Did I get that right? 3 chords, 5,000 people. 5,000 chords, 3 people. And with Pat Metheny and some of those guitar players from the 70s and 80s, I'm sure that becomes more the truth of it. You know, it becomes more about that type of playing and composition. But again, those are kind of white cats, and they're about form. I got to make form that's so intrinsically complex that it impresses me and my ego, and the other players out there have to also be impressed by my form. And some black players got drawn into that, and I think the later generations of black players who came through less struggle were more open to that type of mentality. But when you came up in the 20s and the 30s through the war, the Depression, and then the Second War, and those guys, man, they had enough on their mind where a simple functional form was enough. I got lots to say. Just give me some structure. And what's important with the blues is I can meet with any brother from any black neighborhood in the country. It's 1949. I don't know you, man, but I know your story because I know my story and I know the story of us. And so let me play the blues and let me dig on your story because you know how to play the blues. The simplicity of the functionality is what drives the black side of jazz, and what makes the difference between jazz and white and black so evident to my ears. It's never just about let me make the most complex, difficult thing. It's not even let me play the most complex, difficult solo. Clifford Brown's just saying, this is what's how I feel right now. Armstrong's just saying, this is what's on my soul and needs to be said. And then everyone's got to sit down with their monocle and their pen and magnify it and go, oh, we can actually change tempos on West End Blues on our little intro fanfare and change keys. And Armstrong wasn't being mathematically, he was just being free. The structure and rigidity that so many people associate with jazz represents such a small part of the history of jazz, and it needs to be shifted. We need to get people away from the mindset that jazz is only for complex people who want to have intellectual form and want to sit there and analyze it and go, wow, that was a great G minor 7th diminished. It's not, doesn't ever need to be that. 80% of the body of the jazz canon isn't that. Most of it's very enjoyable. And when I play at my DJ sets, part of my mission is to play jazz that is comfortable to people, and they go, man, I like this one. And young people, I get them, I sell them, they're like, this is awesome. What is this? I'm like, that's Grant Green. That's simple blues, gospel, potato salad music right there. You can sink your teeth into that and not have to be too complex. The ego of complexity, the ego of that built form. That's a misconception and a perception that needs to kind of go away. Did jazz become that in the 60s and the 70s and the fusion? And yeah, it got really artsy and fartsy, and its audience went with it. But for the most part, the body of the jazz canon is not about the most complex structures we can conceive of. And sometimes it's as simple as putting a diminished minor blues chord in place of one of the chords that's in the song to give it a bit of a blue note feel. And I don't mean the label, I mean that the label name comes from the blue notes that the black musicians used to play over accepted song structures. The American Songbook. They would take songs and simply diminish a chord here or there and make that blue note, that sound. So anyway, it's kind of hard to put into words. And I hope I did a decent job expressing how it makes me feel, because I think it's very interesting to understand that it's not a complex music most of the time. It might sound complex. That's because the guy has a long story to tell you. And he's just pouring into his soul. And that story doesn't need to be complex musically. The chord structure doesn't need to be complex for me to emote my situation. In fact, the simpler the chord structure, the more effective I can be in being mindless and not having to be intellectual and thinking about where am I? Oh, that weird chord change is coming up here, that tempo. I don't want any of that. I want to know, okay, it's these 4 chords, and I'm going to play it at this tempo, and I just got to meet back at these places, and now I can improvise endlessly on these 4 chords and express endless ideation. And it might sound complex to your ear, but it's really not. It's just the freedom of my expression. Playing all the intervals that Parker said I can. Parker said you can play the whole scale as long as you resolve it back to the root. And that opens up the doors for all the soloists of the 40s into the 50s into the 60s. And then, of course, the free movement comes along and says, well, let's abandon melody, let's abandon tempo, and make everything formless, and make it lack function, really, what happens. The functionality goes out the window. And I've even heard guys like Charlie Hayden, who played with Ornette Coleman, talk about how the music wasn't free in a lot of ways. It was actually very rehearsed. It was actually very intellectual. You had to be on top of your mental game to be able to play it, which is kind of the opposite of free. The freest jazz in the world is rooted in the blues, requires zero intellectual effort on my part, which means it's a 100% emotional. Improvised emotional experience is what jazz is. And the more intellectual it becomes, the more abstract the form is, the more thought I have to put into it, the less I can just feel and tell you what I feel. I was in the middle of telling you something I felt that was important to me, but my train of thought got broke because we had to make that change right there. And I had a great, and that's why Clifford Brown's so revealing. He's telling you these great long things, and he never allows the composition to distract him. He doesn't need infinite chord changes. He's got this. He's got it down. Give me a Gershwin tune. Give me a Rodgers and Hart song, and get out of my way. You guys got this? 1, 2, 3. Let's go. Oh. It's ridiculous, Al Gray. Anyway, that's it. I'll wrap it up today. Dave Burns, fantastic player. Guy you gotta get to know. He's like, hey, he's out there between the cracks. He shows up in places that you'll be surprised, and he's just a great player. And Al Gray, I've talked about Al Gray plenty, so if you don't know Al Gray yet, you can hear some things from the trombone you didn't know the trombone can do. That's a promise. It's great music. And the white cats can play the blues, and the black cats can play form and complexity. They both can compose it. It's not purely a racial thing. It's just revealed in race based off the different experiences of black and white in this country. See, that's the thing. It's not a racist thing to say black and white play differently, because their experiences is what make them play differently. They lived very different lives. And so what was necessity for them was different. Their priorities were different. And to ignore that and to not be open to hearing the difference and to think that all jazz was just this one. It's not. So much of it's so simple. So simple and so full of freedom and melody and joy. I hate the fact that the perceptions in the common person about jazz do more to discredit jazz and keep people from opening up to it. And as a jazz ambassador, as the jazz shepherd, I feel my job is to A, share my love, but also try to help people understand why this is easy to love. This is not a bad orphan child that you're going to have a tough time getting to know. This is that good kid. It's simple. He does his homework. It'll be a friend. And feeling. That's what moves me. You know, and say it's the same with rock. The most complex rock and roll usually doesn't move me. Even complex soloing, feel. Give me feel. Give me a pulse. You know, Pantera, Rage Against the Machine, those bands changed my perspective on the Beastie Boys. The first time I heard Check Your Head, No Communication, the groove. And then you realize how, okay, this is black. Anyway, be safe. Appreciate you all. We're about to get the domain name paid for the coffee shop, Jazz Shepherd Coffee. We're excited about that. Patreon, and in particular, t-shirts have helped pay for that. So thank you for buying the merch. The next thing we're going to try to collect money for is a neon sign for the coffee shop. It's going to have part of the Jazz Shepherd logo in it with the spinning record and the coffee cup with steam. It's going to be a cool neon sign. We're going to try to raise money for that. So if you want to help make the neon sign for the coffee shop, go to my Patreon. You can contact me and send money through PayPal if you want to do a one-time thing. Or if you want to buy merchandise and get something back for your donation, there's some great stuff in the Jazz Shepherd merch store. Check that stuff out. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.